Hello world, you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. It's Tuesday, March 10th, 2015, Episode 7. I'm your host, John Bruni, and with me in the studio today is co-host and Sage International Associate David Olney from the University of Adelaide and Strategikon producer Alicia Moraw. Good evening to you both.
Good evening, John.
Alicia, what do we see in the news today?
Well, in the Reuters headlines today, EU, Greece to start technical loan talks Wednesday in Brussels. Warning Greece it had no time to lose, Eurozone ministers agreed technical talks between finance experts from Athens and its international creditors would start on Wednesday with the aim of unlocking further funding. Apple Watch in stores on April 24. High-end version costs $10,000. In San Francisco, Apple Inc. will begin selling its new watch in stores on April 24th, with the high-end model starting at $10,000. The company said rolling out its first new product in 5 years in a bid to extend its preeminence in mobile devices. GM plans $5 billion share buyback, agrees deal to avert proxy fight. Detroit. General Motors Company said that Monday it would launch a $5 billion share buyback in an effort to avert a proxy war with dissident investors and detailed a plan that could allocate investors even more cash. US Republicans warn Iran nuclear deal with Obama may not last. Washington. Republican US senators warned Iran's leaders on Monday that any nuclear deal with President Barack Obama could last only as long as he remains in office, an unusual partisan intervention into foreign policy that could undermine delicate international talks with Tehran. Supreme Court revives Notre Dame's Obamacare contraception objections. Washington. The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday revived the University of Notre Dame's religious objections to the requirement for contraception coverage under Barack Obama's healthcare law, throwing out a lower court decision in favor of the federal government. U.S. offers $5 million for a missing American, appeals to Iran. Washington. The United States offered $5 million on Monday for help in finding an American who disappeared in Iran 8 years ago and appealed to Tehran to cooperate in the search for the former FBI agent Robert Levinson. Supreme Court rejects cases on Guantanamo detainee treatment. Washington. The Supreme Court on Monday spurned 2 appeals involving U.S. treatment of Guantanamo Bay detainees, barring a Syrian man from suing the United States over alleged torture and blocking the release of images purported to show evidence of a Saudi man's mistreatment. And finally, oil rebounds from early drop on modest Cushing stock build. In New York, oil prices rose on Monday, rebounding from early losses after market data firm Genscape reported a modest stock build last week at the Cushing, Oklahoma delivery point for U.S. crude. Back to you guys.
Thanks, Alicia. Well, I don't know about you, David, but I don't think I'm going to be getting the high-end Apple Watch anytime soon. $10,000? You've got to be kidding me. I'd rather get a Rolex for that one.
I was just thinking we need to find the American in Iran.
Oh.
If we find him, we can have several watches.
We might just do, absolutely. So the other thing that I think is really interesting is this whole idea of technical talks between the EU and Greece. Initially, I was under the impression that the Greek government, in spite of all its bluster for threatening a Grexit and all these kind of things, seems to be now backtracking on all that. They need to deliver something to the Greek electorate, something that makes sense to them, considering that arguably all Europeans, including the Greeks, signed on to the EU project. So it's becoming a little bit more difficult and a bit more tricky for them to just pack up and bail out of the EU. What are your thoughts?
I love the fact they're calling it technical talks when any such talk has to, of course, be technical. And the people undertaking said talk are technocrats.
Would you say that's a mere technicality?
I think it's a technicality that there are technocrats at the technical talks. But unfortunately, what else is at the technical talks is the people that caused the problem in the first place.
The EU.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Greeks.
Technically speaking. Well, that's really quite amazing. Maybe they can all go out and buy themselves Apple Watches, considering the fact that they're probably on a very good income.
I'm going to try and be sensible now and suggest that really the key issue is the fact that if one state defaults and leaves the Union, then the Union's really in trouble. And if Greece leaves, it's still everyone's neighbour. Greeks will still be looking to work in the rest of Europe. There will still be mayhem. So better mayhem inside and with some leverage through money than mayhem with someone on the outside where you don't have leverage anymore. And realistically, the government in Greece just wanted to be heard as saying, stop just being technocrats. What you do affects people. And at some level, the European finance ministers seem to be making noises that they do understand now that, yes, it's about balancing the books one day, but on the way there, at least the noise needs to be more human-centric.
So you think that they're actually capable of taking that leap?
No. How's that for a one-word answer?
No, it's a pretty good one-word answer. It's very definitive. But so if they can't move out of their technocratic idea of what the EU should be about, that it's not about people, it's about statistics, then we are looking at some major schism breaking out at some point in the not-too-distant future.
I guess what we're seeing is a bureaucracy and a technocracy reaching its illogical size, and despite the GFC having not shrunk and repurposed and rethought yet. While everything was good and the German economy could chug the world forward, then it was fine for the EU to progressively become more technocratic and more bureaucratic and see people simply as things to be legislated or organised or mandated. Well, when things are bad, people want to be treated a little better than that. And the foibles of being a human being aren't easy to sum up for a technocrat. And yet the future of the Union has to be dealing with crises that people make and that people have to find a way out of without being dehumanised. And that's a different EU than the one we've got at the moment.
Absolutely, but one thing that always strikes me odd is the idea that if you happen to be a technocrat sitting in Brussels and you look at this thing called Europe on a map, you're going to have to try to come up with very simple solutions for very complex problems, which means adopting, for want of a better terminology, a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach to standardize and homogenize something that is, by its very nature, heterogeneous. So if you do that, you're destroying the very fabric that made Europe creative to begin with, which was its diversity and the conflicts that actually built that diversity.
I think they've forgotten the original reason, which was people who are economically intertwined are hopefully less likely to kill each other. Now, the economic intertwining is to such a degree now that Europeans do better together than they could do separately. Some countries could do better on their own, but in the main, most benefit from good economic relations, ease of travel, and it's now time for the institution to reflect the best of what Europe can do, which is actually keep people recognising they do better together than they can do individually. And that's a very different mission to balancing the books by a one-size-fits-all, and it will take time to evolve. We've only just had a massive World Bank report based around behavioural economics. And it's probably one of the best summaries of behavioural economics. We've now got a World Bank run by an anthropologist.
As it should be.
Well, I agree. But if the World Bank can begin to transform and recognise that you have to understand people to improve economic conditions, there is absolutely no reason why the EU can't do it. The World Bank had to change, who did what job, and there's no reason that the European Union can't do the same thing. I'm not saying it will do the same thing, but if the World Bank can change and now be led by someone who 20 years ago was tearing strips off it, then it is possible for economics to be done understanding how people think and behave and taking human needs into consideration when balancing the books.
How can you take human needs into consideration when in actual fact, you're still looking at people as economic units? Ideally, a lot of Europe's ugly underbelly, like, for instance, virulent nationalism and all that kind of stuff, and unemployment and social problems at the cohesion level, this can't be just pushed aside by some economic policy. There's got to be more than that.
No, there's got to be social policy, and that's probably the main reason for trying to keep the Greeks in Europe. The recognition, if we start letting people leave because they won't follow the technocratic line, well, how many people are going to be left as economic times get harder, security becomes more complex, the way people define their identity and define how and what level of human security they want becomes more complex. Technocrats aren't going to find answers for this. The EU, in the long run, is going to have to come up with very watered-down compromises that everyone can live with. But that's very different to trying a one-size-fits-all version of an antiquated form of economic policy.
Okay, over to you, Alicia.
Dominating the headlines this week is the saga surrounding the impending execution of Bali 9 duo Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukumaran. Is Indonesia's implacable stand on executing the two Australians simply playing to an international political dynamic within Indonesia? Should capital punishment be outlawed internationally? Was there hypocrisy in Indonesia's stand? And what does this say about the state of Indonesian-Australian relations?
Nothing has really been good between Australia and Indonesia since I can remember, David. There have always been these promises of steady relations and we have to treat the Indonesians well and all this kind of thing. But you know what? Indonesian and Australian society are about as polarised as two societies can possibly be, at least at the political level. And, there have been a lot of people who've been suggesting that, the Indonesians are playing hypocrites because there have been a number of Indonesian nationals who were drug runners who were also on death row, but the Indonesian president at the time had pardoned them and so on and so forth. So are the Australian drug runners singled out for special attention?
I'd go back to the relationship first because I've got to say, does anyone remember F-111s and why we bought them?
Yeah.
How really can Australian-Indonesian relations be good when we buy a long-range bomber that was designed to turn one of our near neighbours into a glow-in-the-dark non-fun park?
Well, just for those listeners who don't know what the F-111 is, it was a swing-wing bomber, which was actually an intermediate-range strategic bomber that the Americans had created for themselves, and the Australians bought 24 of them, and basically they were nuclear capable. And David's absolutely right. We bought those bombers with the idea of keeping the Indonesians under control at a time that there was huge political instability in the archipelago. So, yeah.
So that kind of history can't be overcome very quickly. And the number of times that the Australian-Indonesian relationship was affected by what the Americans wanted, often to the cost of one of us or both of us, to now the idea that we have to work out a relationship on our own with a country going through growing pains, where we're going through economic decline pains, of course it's problematic. Why is anyone surprised? And at a personal level, what Indonesians and Australians think of each other, really? In the main, Indonesians come here to study. We go there on holidays. That doesn't give us a very even sense of what each other's countries are like, or what each other's futures are like, or whether our futures are intertwined. And in both cases, we have politicians playing to home markets.
I think that the real hypocrisy, to a certain degree, happens to be at the public diplomatic level, where we have our politicians all saying that Indonesia is our greatest friend in the region, should be our greatest ally in the region, should be this, should be that. And every time those concepts come up against the stark reality of our differences, it just all falls badly on the ground. There's nothing that we really can do to sort of stitch this relationship together and make it sustainable for the duration.
I don't understand why we have to use the friend word all the time, why we can't say that they're simply a regional partner, that we share so many common interests that it's better to address together, and at least start to establish some solid ground and focus on the things we do achieve together. This is an example of two people who are likely to be shot very soon, who, because of interaction between law enforcement in two countries, were caught there rather than something happening here. There's all sorts of other law enforcement situations where there's positive stories. It seems so easy here to fixate on calling each other friends when what we are is partners in a regional setting, or to focus on bad outcomes when practical good outcomes are out there, but they're not very exciting to report on.
So do you think that the potential execution of the Bali 9 duo is a media beat up, and what role has the media actually played in creating this sense of bad blood between Australia and Indonesia?
Media needs something to chase, don't they? There's always got to be a car, an ambulance, or a cat.
So the old adage that if it bleeds, it leads is really what the standard kind of reportage tends to sort of give to us, yeah?
Yeah, and that's the terrible thing here. We're waiting for 2 young men to die through other people's hands, and it to be state authorised. What a perfect opportunity for Australian media to have another one of its moments of hyping up something that is horrible enough. You know, let's get the basics right here. Indonesia has the right to create a legal system of its own choosing. It did. And it appears the legal system worked the way it should. And despite forms of corruption in other areas in Indonesia, it appears in this case that the legal system did its job, and did its job admirably, other than a silly selfie taken by a certain police officer on a plane. Really, as much as we might morally have a problem with this, do we think it's immoral to put 2 young men to death for drug trafficking? That can be our only concern.
One thing that I don't think gets enough media airtime, of course, is that what would have happened had the Bali 9 successfully transported their recreational drugs to the Indonesian marketplace, back to the Australian marketplace, and back to Indonesia again? How many families would have been ruined as a consequence of the action of this just this one group of people? And who cries about this? I mean, it was interesting to see the political circus in Canberra, where all the politicians were making this anti-capital punishment statement and candlelight vigils and so on and so forth for these 2 young men, these poor young men caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time. These guys made a deliberate act to do something that would have harmed elements of the Australian community and or the Indonesian community had they just continued to traffic their drugs without sanction. So is it a case that even if you do a deliberate act to harm a community, you're still a victim? How does this is a peculiar thing that seems to play out in Australia constantly. Maybe this is part of our convict heritage. What do you think?
I think Alicia has something she wants to say.
Go ahead.
It's amazing that there's no consequence if they're overseas and something happens to them because they're crying out for diplomatic help. But really, they should face the consequences of what they're doing. I mean, there was that whole thing about Chappelle Corby and all that. So it wasn't as if they were going in unaware of the strict laws that Indonesia has about drug trafficking.
Anyone flying into a Southeast Asian country knows that there is an announcement on the plane saying that there are laws of that land that include capital punishment for the possession and the trafficking of drugs. So you're absolutely right, Alicia. The interesting thing is that people tend to forget these little legal nuances and for their own political gain, I suppose. I don't know. It's beyond me, really.
I think this consequences line of investigation is the critical one. When do we ever talk about consequences in Australia? We talk about terrible things happen. Oh, it was this person's fault. It was this situation's fault. Well, we all contribute by the choices we make. And they may have been very stupid young men. But there's no provision in our legal system or the Indonesian legal system that just because you're a stupid young man that you get to get out of trouble.
Yeah.
And, they've rehabilitated in jail. Well, I'd rather rehabilitate in jail and not attract more bad attention. I'd rather enhance my chances that maybe I don't take a bullet to the head. So rehabilitating under the sentence of potential life in prison or death isn't a major prize. It just is. You do the best you can with what you got. They're in a situation where they had a choice. They've chosen to rehabilitate themselves. That's a better choice than they made earlier in their life. But we can't undo the choices they made. We can't change the fact there's consequences. And if they can't learn from the consequences that other people have had to endure, then that is unfortunate. But really, the fact that the debate here seems to have confused the moral with the judicial is really worrisome. We've been having a moral debate and pretending it's a judicial debate, that we can somehow impact on Indonesian justice. We can't. Their judicial system did what it did. And we can be morally outraged and morally upset, or actually at this point, I just wish it would happen sooner, so the poor guys have to stop thinking about what happens tomorrow. At some point, there's an inevitability that your choices are going to come to an end point.
I think that the cruelty in terms of contemporary death sentences is the incredibly long waiting periods. I mean, once sentence has been passed, the execution should be carried out relatively shortly thereafter, as opposed to waiting, in some cases, in the United States, for instance, years, maybe even decades before, the inevitability happens. And I think that there is a sort of implied psychological cruelty just in that structure alone. Maybe that's part of the punishment. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it is actually part of the argument that no one's proved that the death penalty stops anyone doing anything. But maybe the hope is by dragging this out. Dragging out the exercise of moving them to, the execution island. Well, anywhere you can line up your special police unit, you can do the terrible job. Why stuff around? Why inflict this unless the aim is a media frenzy? And, we have to remember that nationalism and the sense of national identity and national ability to choose their own destiny is very important in Indonesia. It's going through a period of massive transformation. It's deciding what it's going to be and how it's going to behave in the world and how it wants to be treated. It's got expectations just like us.
Also dominating the headlines this week is the aftermath of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the US Congress. Will this derail American efforts at reaching out to Iran? Was Netanyahu's stance really focused on shoring up his domestic Israeli constituency in the lead-up to Israel's national elections? Can the US really be swayed by the powerful Israeli lobby inside Washington Beltway on issues of foreign policy?
I think I can sum that up by saying, yes, it can. It can be influenced by the powerful Israeli lobby. It has been influenced for a long, long time. But now the situation seems to be changing slightly. I think that now there's a bit of a pushback. And the interesting thing, David, is that there's a pushback from Israelis abroad. For many years, one was under the impression that AIPAC, the leading American Jewish lobby, was so powerful that it could actually literally crack the whip on anywhere in Washington, and the Washington political elite would basically lockstep into whatever AIPAC wanted. But now even the Jewish community abroad in the United States are not happy necessarily with following Benjamin Netanyahu's very right-wing policies. And I think that we've seen only recently in Israel, in the streets of Tel Aviv and elsewhere, thousands of Jewish protesters against the current government. So it's certainly interesting times.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see that we seem to now have in America an Israel lobby who are very much for how they want the state to be, and a Jewish lobby thinking about what might be best for the Jewish people worldwide. And it seems that there is a chance that there will be some sort of divergence between the Israel lobby and the Jewish lobby, that what's good for the state, according to the Israeli Prime Minister, and what's good for the state, according to Jews across the world, might be very different. And that the Republicans in the US seem to follow the Israeli lobby, and a lot of other people try and listen to the Jewish lobby, and that inevitably this is going to lead to tension and pressures on American foreign policy.
Getting back to the headlines that Alicia was reading out, and the US Republicans warn Iran nuclear deal with Obama may not last, suggesting that any nuclear deal that Iran reaches with the United States will only last as long as the term that Obama has left in office. Now, this was really the brainchild of Barack Obama. He did want to reach out to the Iranians and break that diplomatic logjam that basically froze relations in a state of Cold War between Tehran and Washington for 30-odd years. But ultimately, what do we do with Republicans who are now starting to sort of come out of the closet and suggest that, maybe Netanyahu is right? Are the Republicans making a resurgence in the United States? It looks to me that it's a bit of a mixed bag at the moment, considering their presidential candidates don't look particularly inviting or strong.
I suppose that's the interesting thing, is that the whole point is people voted those people into Congress. They're not just the representatives, they're the representatives of enough American people to be sitting in the Congress. And they've got sufficient confidence, or mania, I'm not quite sure which, to believe they can dictate foreign policy to the president when it's the president's preserve. So what they can do will probably be determined by how much they want to push, and whether the Democrats can push back, and whether the American people want to tolerate this kind of vitriolic politics long term. So, Iran might be trying to negotiate, but will it have people to negotiate with who will be reasonable? Is anyone being reasonable in this situation? It seems that Iran has tried to be reasonable at the negotiating table, despite an awful lot of provocation from multiple sources that they won't abide by deals, they won't tell the truth, they won't do this, they won't do that.
This is all very complex, considering Iran's very open hand that they're playing in the war against ISIL, which is obviously an enemy both America and Iran have in common. And if the idea that Obama had was to try to break the diplomatic logjam, to make, to bring Iran in from the cold and make them more amenable to U.S. policy in the region, to basically retake up the cudgels of becoming America's policeman, if you like, in the Gulf area. You could imagine that this obviously is going to play really badly among the Arab capitals in the Gulf. You can also imagine that the Israelis, and I can almost understand Netanyahu's issues with this whole process, considering that under the former president Ahmadinejad, the Iranian state was making all kinds of threats against Israel, for which the new president has not openly recanted. They haven't come out and said, "Oh, look, sorry, Israel, we've got a new leader now, and it's all good between you and I," and blah blah blah. No, it's not. There's those unspoken issues that have come forward, which I think also muddy the waters at the diplomatic level.
I guess one of the things that's probably added to all the problems here is that when it suited the Americans, when they didn't want to put large numbers of boots on the ground, it was easy to talk to Iran and say, "Hey, common enemy, what can we do together?" But this is so different from the last 30 years. How, as you said, does the Arab world deal with this? How does Israel deal with this? Now, the fact that the new Iranian president, he hasn't recanted what his predecessor said, well, at least he's not saying the same things. In terms of Iranian politics, this is a pretty big leap forward.
Well, yes, you just have to try to speak to Benjamin Netanyahu about that, because I don't think that he sees any difference between the new presidency of Hassan Rouhani and Ahmadinejad. So I don't think that he sees that nuanced approach.
How would he see any difference in material of what happened? He's in a situation of feeling besieged, sometimes for legitimate reasons, sometimes for reasons, it appears, of his own political beliefs. How do we get either of them to say, look, some of this is real, some of it's old tension, and some of it is the desperate desire to protect your people in any way you can?
The interesting thing about the history of Israel and Iran is that under the secular, although slightly brutal leadership of the former Shah, the Israelis and the Iranians got on splendidly well. Which leads one to believe that so long as Tehran maintains the theocracy, it will always be a case of tension between Tel Aviv and Tehran. There's not going to be any sort of real mending of fences there, which will then always be a thorn in America's side in terms of it wanting to impose its values in the region. Yeah,
particularly when it can't do things as it's traditionally done. It can't tell the Arab world to behave and treat Israel as a special friend and keep poking Iran with a stick. Somehow there's got to be a better balance here. The Arab world doesn't get an opportunity to make its own choices as much as it should. Iran, well, it can try and build a modern state with all these problems in front of it and still manage to build a modern state of sorts. And Israel is still stuck in a neighbourhood that is permanently destabilised by the way America deals with all its neighbours. So, really, the idea that when Bill Clinton was in power, he thought he could help bring about a peace deal in the Middle East, like, had the guy been blowing way too hard in his saxophone? Was he getting the head spins that he believed that was humanly possible?
Yes.
What does Obama think he can really achieve in a region when people with far more gravitas than him have had no long-lasting impact? What does Benny Netanyahu think he's going to achieve? You know, as a young man, he put his body on the line. As an old man, he's putting his country's future on the line. It's in keeping with his life of service to his country, but it's a life of service defined in a particular way.
Well, that's a wrap for this week. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to your company again next week. Our thanks to producer Alicia Moraw, David Olney, and for now, goodbye from the Strategikon team.